My name is Emily, and I am 24 years old. 3 days ago, I stood shivering on the icy shoulder of Highway 55 in the Idaho mountains, watching a police tow truck haul away my only means of escape. I was holding a crumpled duplicate medical school acceptance letter in my numb hands. The police officer told me he was sorry, but my father had just reported the car stolen. My own father called the cops on me to prevent me from driving to my final admissions appeal. He preferred to see me stranded on the side of a mountain rather than see me become a doctor. He wanted me trapped behind the counter of his deli for the rest of my life. But he had no idea I was holding a federal document that was about to tear his world apart. Before I tell you how I fought back, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia's Stories Revenge, but only do it if you know what it feels like to have your family stand in the way of your dreams. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I want to know who is here with me today. Now let me take you back 72 hours earlier to the moment the walls began to close in. It was a Tuesday morning in Boise. The winter inversion layer had trapped a gray smog over the Treasure Valley, making the air outside taste like exhaust. Inside the North End Deli, the air tasted like bleach and pastrami. That smell was baked into my skin. I had spent my entire life standing behind that glass display case, slicing corned beef and wiping down stainless steel counters. For the past year, I had been working 60-hour weeks for my dad while studying for the MCAT on a milk crate by the back door. My dad, Hank, was hovering near the prep station. He popped a Tums into his mouth and rubbed his left shoulder. He did that whenever he was stressed, which was constantly. The ancient walk-in freezer was groaning again, leaking Freon onto the floor. Instead of calling a repairman, he turned his attention to the glass jar on the counter, the sourdough starter. It was 50 years old, brought over by his grandfather. He fed it flour and water with religious devotion. That jar was his legacy. To him, it was the only thing keeping a roof over our heads. To me, it was an anchor tied to my ankle. The morning mail arrived. My mother Susan brought it in from the front box, sorting through the bills with quiet, nervous movements. She handed me a stack of envelopes. 3 of them bore the return addresses of medical schools I had applied to, lower-tier safety schools. I ripped them open one by one, standing right there next to the meat slicer. "We regret to inform you, we are unable to offer you a seat. After careful consideration, 3 rejections in 3 minutes. I dropped the papers on the counter. My chest grew tight. The WWAMI program was my last hope. It was a regional medical partnership for Idaho residents and my top choice. The online admissions portal had been down for maintenance all week. Everything depended on the physical letter arriving in the mail. If I did not get into that program, I was going to die in this deli. Dad walked over and looked at the rejected letters scattered next to the cash register. He chewed his Tums. "I told you, Emily," he said, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You waste your energy chasing fairy tales. Doctors are buried in debt. You have a real business right here, real security. You need to focus on the catering order for the Treefort Music Fest. Stop dreaming and start slicing." He handed me a large stainless steel tray filled with industrial jars of pickles for the lunch rush. My hands were shaking. The lack of sleep, the rejections, the smell of vinegar, and the heavy weight of his expectations hit me all at once. My grip slipped. The tray crashed to the floor. Glass shattered everywhere, sending green brine pooling across the linoleum. Customers at the front counter turned to stare. I wanted to deliver a sharp, brilliant response. I wanted to tell him I was meant for more than wiping down meat scales. Instead, my throat closed up. I stood in the puddle of pickle juice covered in glass shards and started to cry. Ugly, hyperventilating sobs right in front of a dozen strangers. I had nothing clever to say. I just stood there weeping while my dad shook his head in disgust and walked back to his precious sourdough. 7 days evaporated into the harsh winter air. The deadline to accept the WWAMI medical program offer came and went in agonizing silence. The online admissions portal remained down for unexpected maintenance, displaying a persistent error code that mocked my anxiety every time I refreshed the page on my phone. The physical letter I desperately needed never arrived. At least that is what I told myself. Downtown Boise was gearing up for the Treefort Music Fest, and the entire city felt like a pressure cooker. The deli was overwhelmed with an endless stream of catering orders. Hundreds of turkey clubs and roast beef sandwiches needed to be prepped, boxed, and loaded for the festival crowds. I worked through the weekend in a state of sleep-deprived panic. My hands assembled sandwiches on autopilot while my mind raced through every dark scenario. Had my application been lost in the mail? Did the post office route it to the wrong zip code? Or was I simply not good enough to make the cut? My mother Susan was acting erratic all week. She hovered around the dishwashing station, scrubbing the deep industrial prep sink with a frantic, nervous energy. Her knuckles were raw and red from the hot water. She refused to meet my eyes when we bumped into each other in the narrow aisle behind the deli counter. She kept her head down, slicing provolone and wrapping orders without saying a single word. I chalked her behavior up to the immense stress of the festival rush. We were all exhausted, and the tension in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife. I was too wrapped up in my own sinking despair to pay closer attention to her overwhelming guilt. Tuesday afternoon arrived, bringing a brief lull in the relentless lunch rush. I grabbed a green scouring pad and walked over to the prep sink to clear out the grease trap. Susan quickly stepped in front of me, holding a heavy bottle of bleach like a shield. She told me she would handle the cleaning and urged me to go rest in the back office. Her voice was high-pitched and tight-laced with a tremor she could not hide. I ignored her and reached past her shoulder to pull the metal grate from the drain. The basin was clogged with dark, murky water. I plunged my gloved hand into the drain trap and pulled out a fistful of wet debris. It was not discarded food scraps. It was thick, heavy parchment paper. The edges were charred black, turning to mush in the soapy water. But the center of the paper was still intact. I smoothed the wet clump out on the stainless steel counter. The ink had bled, but I recognized the intricate purple design immediately. The University of Washington School of Medicine. It was the official letterhead of the WWAMI regional program. What hurts more, the person who holds the match, or the one who sweeps away the ashes? I stared at the burned, soggy paper. It was my acceptance letter. Someone had intercepted my mail, set it on fire, and tried to wash the evidence down the drain. I turned to my mother. She was gripping the bleach bottle so tight her hands were shaking. She looked cornered and terrified. I jumped to the most obvious conclusion. She was the one obsessively scrubbing the sink all week. She was the one avoiding my gaze. I looked at this woman who had surrendered her own dream of becoming a teacher just to stand behind a meat slicer for 30 years. I felt a hot, dark venom rise in my throat. I cornered her against the prep table. I did not ask her for a rational explanation. I verbally attacked her. I asked her if she felt proud of herself for ruining my life. I asked her if dragging me down into her miserable, grease-stained reality made her feel better about her own endless failures. I told her she was a coward who could not bear to see her daughter succeed where she had given up. My words were precise and cruel, designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain possible. Susan did not defend herself. She just stood there trembling under the fluorescent lights. Tears spilled over her cheeks, falling onto her flour-dusted apron. She opened her mouth to speak, but she was crying too hard to form the words. She just kept shaking her head side to side, a silent plea for me to stop tearing her apart. Then the heavy metal door of the walk-in freezer swung open. Hank walked out carrying a heavy wooden crate of cured meats. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Susan weeping and me holding the charred remains of the letter. He set the crate down and rubbed his left shoulder, letting out a heavy, weary sigh. He did not look surprised to see the burned paper in my hands. He looked defiant. "Leave your mother alone, Emily," he commanded. His voice echoed off the tile walls, sharp and authoritative. She did not do it. She was just cleaning up the mess because she was too scared to tell you the truth. The room started to spin. I looked from Susan to Hank. My own father had stolen my mail. He read my medical school acceptance letter, struck a match, and watched my future burn in the prep sink. He stepped toward me, closing the distance between us. He did not sound like a villain who enjoyed causing pain. He sounded like a desperate, terrified man trying to convince himself he had done the right thing. "I saved you," he told me, pointing a calloused finger at my chest. "You think that piece of paper is a golden ticket. It is a financial trap. Do you know how much debt medical school requires? Hundreds of thousands of dollars. They tie a financial noose around your neck before you even touch a single patient." He leaned over the counter, his face red with conviction. I watched my dad lose the family farm to the banks when I was a kid. I watched men in expensive suits take everything he owned because he signed loan papers he did not understand. I built this deli from nothing so you would never have to owe anyone a single dime. You have real security right here under this roof. You have a business that feeds people and pays the bills. Doctors are just glorified debt slaves working for the insurance companies. I threw that letter away to protect you. I kept you safe. His logic was twisted, rooted in a deep generational trauma he refused to heal. He truly believed he was rescuing me from certain financial ruin. But he was not protecting me. He was protecting his own fragile sense of control. He needed my cheap labor, and he needed me trapped under his roof to feel secure in his own life. The deadline to accept the medical school seat had passed yesterday. Because of his panicked sabotage, my spot was gone. The medical board had surely given it to the next student on the wait list. 4 years of late-night studying, 4 years of sacrificing my youth, 4 years of dreaming about wearing a white coat, all reduced to wet ash in a deli sink. I did not deliver a powerful, triumphant speech. I did not storm out the back door with my head held high. I broke. The sheer injustice of the betrayal cracked my spine. I turned around and swiped my arm across the stainless steel prep counter. A tray stacked high with expensive imported prosciutto and salami crashed to the floor. The ceramic platter shattered into 100 pieces. Meat and broken pottery scattered across the greasy tile. I dropped to my knees right in the middle of the mess. I pulled my knees to my chest and wept. I sobbed so hard my ribs ached, drawing in jagged breaths of air that tasted like vinegar and deep despair. My father just watched me cry, refusing to apologize for breaking my heart because he believed he was right. My mother hid her face in her hands, too afraid of his temper to kneel down and comfort me. I sat on that floor surrounded by the wreckage of my parents' betrayal, feeling a profound, consuming emptiness. I had no money in my bank account. I had no car in my own name. The admissions deadline was dead and buried. My father had successfully locked the door to my future and thrown away the key. There was no way out of the North End deli. I prepared to surrender to a lifetime of slicing pastrami and smelling like bleach. But fate has a funny way of delivering salvation when you least expect it. The next morning I was mindlessly ringing up customers at the front register when a sharp, heavy knock echoed from the back delivery door. I dragged my feet down the hallway expecting to find a vendor dropping off a shipment of sourdough flour. Instead, I opened the heavy steel door and found someone who held a secret that was about to turn my father's quiet crime into a federal nightmare. Wednesday morning arrived with the stinging chill unique to the Treasure Valley in deep winter. I moved behind the deli counter like a ghost. My hands assembled sandwiches, wrapped them in butcher paper, and handed them to customers without my brain processing a single action. I felt hollowed out. The tears from the previous afternoon had dried, leaving my skin tight and my eyes burning under the harsh fluorescent lights. Hank strutted down the narrow aisle behind the glass display case, humming a low tune under his breath. He wore his stained white apron like a badge of honor. He seemed lighter today. His posture lacked the usual rigid tension that accompanied his 12-hour shifts. In his mind, the threat had been neutralized. He had successfully severed my tie to the outside world and secured his free labor for the next 40 years. He slapped a stack of incoming invoices onto the prep table and told me to balance the register before the lunch rush hit. He walked past me, radiating the smug confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. I stared at the back of his neck, feeling a terrifying mix of hatred and profound exhaustion. A sharp, heavy knock rattled the steel delivery door at the back of the kitchen. It was too early for the produce vendor, and the bread delivery had already arrived at dawn. I wiped my hands on a damp towel and dragged my feet down the dim hallway. The heavy metal door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open, bracing myself against the biting Idaho wind. Standing on the frozen concrete loading dock was Gary. He wore his standard blue United States Postal Service jacket, zipped up to his chin, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Gary had been walking the North End route since I was in elementary school. He knew everyone. He knew which houses tipped well during the holidays and which businesses were struggling to make rent. For years, he had watched me sit on an overturned milk crate in this exact alley studying flashcards while taking my 15-minute breaks. Gary stomped his boots on the concrete, shaking off a thick layer of snow. He let out a ragged sigh, rubbing his gloved hands together. He muttered a complaint about navigating the steep, icy roads up in the Boise foothills, where the city plows rarely reached before noon. He said the ice on Harrison Boulevard was terrible, but the foothills were a death trap this morning. I gave him a weak nod, expecting him to hand me a stack of returned mail or a misdelivered package. Instead, he stood there looking at me with an expression of deep, calculated sorrow. His gaze scanned my face, lingering on my red, swollen eyelids. He reached inside his heavy canvas mailbag and pulled out a pristine flat cardboard mailer. He did not hand it to me immediately. He held it against his chest. "Emily," he started, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "I saw the envelope on Monday, the one with the purple crest from the university. I know how hard you worked for that piece of mail. I put it directly into your father's hands because he met me at the front door. I thought I was delivering good news." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then yesterday afternoon, I was walking past the alley on my second loop. I saw your dad empty the trash. When he went back inside, I noticed some charred paper stuck to the side of the dumpster. I pulled it out. It was thick parchment. The ink was running, but I could still read the crest. I felt the cold wind slice through my thin cotton shirt, but I could not bring myself to shiver. My blood turned to ice water. Gary knew. The neighborhood postman had pieced together the quiet domestic sabotage my father committed. Gary extended his arm and handed me the cardboard mailer. He told me he went back to the post office and called the regional admissions board in Moscow, Idaho. He explained he was the local carrier and requested they issue a duplicate notice because the original had been damaged in transit. He did not tell them the full truth over the phone. He just knew I needed the document in my hands. I tore the tab off the mailer with shaking fingers. Inside sat a crisp, clean sheet of paper bearing the words I had sacrificed my youth to earn. "Congratulations on your acceptance to the WWAMI Medical Partnership." The letters blurred together as a fresh wave of tears threatened to spill over my eyelashes. I had the proof. I had the ticket out. But Gary gently touched my arm, pulling me back to reality. "There is a catch," he warned. "The admissions officer told me the deadline to accept the seat expired. Because the system did not receive your confirmation, your spot was automatically handed to the first student on the wait list." I stopped breathing. The paper in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as lead. Gary spoke quickly, laying out the narrow path forward. He said the officer granted a 2-week grace period for a formal appeal. I had 14 days to drive up to the campus stand in front of the medical board and plead my case in person to reinstate my admission. It was a lifeline thinner than a thread, but it existed. I clutched the letter to my chest, whispering my gratitude over and over. I promised him I would never forget his kindness. I turned to walk back into the deli, ready to figure out the logistics of the trip. But Gary did not turn away. He shifted his weight on the icy concrete and cleared his throat. "Emily," he said softly, "there is something else. Something you need to know before you go back in there." I turned back, facing the bitter wind. Gary looked down at his boots, then back up at my face. "I could not just let it go," he confessed. "Taking someone else's mail, destroying it, is not just a mean-spirited parenting tactic. It is a federal offense. Sometimes your savior wears a blue uniform and carries the exact bureaucracy that will destroy your family." Gary reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carbon copy receipt. He explained that after he recovered the burned remnants from the dumpster, he drove to the Federal Postal Inspection Office downtown. He filed a formal sworn report regarding the intentional destruction of federal mail. He handed over the charred evidence to a federal inspector. The gravity of his words hit me with the force of a freight train. A formal investigation, a federal crime. My father was not just a controlling bully anymore. He was a suspect facing potential prison time. The sheer magnitude of the situation twisted my stomach into tight, agonizing knots. I was holding the key to my future, but I was also carrying the horrifying weight of my father's impending legal ruin. The stress fractured my remaining composure. I dropped the cardboard mailer onto the loading dock. I stumbled 2 steps toward the rusted green dumpster leaning heavily against the frozen metal rim. My body revolted. My stomach heaved hard, expelling the meager contents of my morning coffee into the trash bin. The sour taste of bile coated my mouth. My knees buckled and I slumped against the cold brick wall of the alleyway, gasping for air. Gary stepped forward, offering a napkin from his pocket, his face etched with regret. He apologized for putting this burden on my shoulders, but insisted the law was the law. I wiped my mouth and gathered the precious letter from the concrete. I stood up on trembling legs, thanking him again despite the horrific storm gathering on the horizon. I pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped back into the suffocating warmth of the deli kitchen. The smell of curing meat and baked yeast washed over me. I walked down the narrow hallway and peered into the front of the shop. Hank was leaning against the cash register, joking loudly with a regular customer. He threw his head back and laughed, slapping his hand against the countertop. The dramatic irony was a bitter pill to swallow. He stood there acting like the untouchable king of his grease-stained castle, unaware that a federal hammer was suspended directly over his head, waiting to drop. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured my servitude. He had no idea the local postman had just initiated his downfall. I retreated into the tiny back office and closed the door. I smoothed the acceptance letter out on the desk. The appeal hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks from today. I had a chance to fight for my seat. But reading the fine print at the bottom of the page, my brief flicker of hope slammed into a brick wall. The university required a $3,000 non-refundable seat deposit to hold my spot pending the appeal. The funds had to be transferred via a private bridge loan before the committee would even look at my file. I needed a loan. I needed money I did not have. I reached for my purse to dig out my identification, knowing I had to visit the credit union immediately. I assumed securing a small student loan would be a simple bureaucratic hurdle. I had no idea my father had already anticipated that escape route and buried a financial landmine under my name years before I ever thought to leave. I folded the duplicate acceptance letter and slipped it into the inner pocket of my winter coat. The tiny back office of the deli offered no real sanctuary, but for 10 minutes it gave me the silence I needed to formulate a plan. The medical board required a $3,000 non-refundable seat deposit to hold my spot for the appeals hearing. Federal student aid rules classify all medical students as independent applicants, regardless of age or living situation. I did not need my father's tax returns. I did not need his signature or his permission. I just needed a private bridge loan to cover the deposit until the government funds dispersed in the fall. I walked out of the office and slipped through the chaotic kitchen. Hank was busy yelling at the bread supplier over a mismatched invoice. Susan was frantically refilling the napkin dispensers. Neither of them noticed me grab my car keys from the hook by the back door. I pushed through the heavy steel exit and stepped into the freezing alleyway. The drive downtown took less than 15 minutes, but every traffic light felt like an hour. I navigated the icy streets heading toward the Basque Block. The rich scent of fried croquetas and garlic from the local restaurants usually brought a sense of comfort, but today my stomach was tied in knots. I parked my rusted sedan near a brick building that housed a prominent Idaho credit union. Stepping through the glass doors, I felt a strange, unfamiliar surge of independence. The bank lobby was quiet and sterile. It smelled like fresh paper and floor wax, a sharp contrast to the suffocating aroma of cured meats and bleach I carried on my clothes. I was taking control of my own life. I was going to sit across from a professional sign, my name on a dotted line, and buy my freedom. A young loan officer with a neat tie and a polite smile gestured for me to sit at his desk. I handed over my driver license and explained my situation. I told him I had just been accepted to the WWAMI Regional Medical Program and needed a short-term personal loan to cover an urgent seat deposit. I assured him the federal loans would cover the balance in a few months. He nodded, typing my information into his keyboard with practiced ease. He asked for my social security number. I recited the digits from memory. He clicked his mouse. His polite smile faltered. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing as he scrolled down the screen. He clicked another button, and a heavy silence settled over the cubicle. Emily. He started, his voice dropping to a low, cautious register. Were you aware of the current status of your credit file before coming in today? I shook my head, feeling a cold prickle of dread at the base of my neck. I told him I had no credit history. I explained I had never opened a credit card or taken out a car loan because my parents handled all the finances. The loan officer turned the monitor so I could see the screen. Rows of red text glared back at me. He pointed to the top line with his pen. He told me he could not approve a $300 loan, let alone $3,000. My credit score was ruined. I stared at the numbers trying to comprehend the data. The screen listed $45,000 in defaulted commercial debt. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. The itemized list detailed several high-interest business loans, 2 industrial meat slicers, a commercial convection oven, a walk-in freezer compressor unit. Default notices and collections warnings were stacked one on top of the other dating back 6 years. 6 years ago, my 18th birthday. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table eating a slice of cake. Hank had placed a stack of documents in front of me along with a pen. He told me he needed my Social Security number and my signature for some routine Deli payroll taxes. He said it was just standard government paperwork to keep me on the books as an employee. I signed without reading. I trusted him. He was my father. But his own credit had been destroyed decades ago. The trauma of watching his childhood farm face foreclosure had not made him financially responsible. It had made him desperate. When the deli equipment started failing, he could not secure the capital to replace it. So he stole his daughter's financial identity to keep his precious sourdough business afloat. He saddled me with crippling high-interest debt before I even knew how to write a check. How do you escape a prison when the warden used your own name to buy the locks? The loan officer watched my face drain of color. He asked if I recognized these charges. He gently suggested that if this was a case of familial identity theft, I would need to file a formal police report and contact the fraud department. If I pressed charges, the debt could be cleared from my record. I sat frozen in the leather chair. The walls of the quiet bank lobby seemed to shrink. Pressing charges meant sending my father to prison for fraud. Gary the postman had already filed a federal report for the tampered mail. If I added $45,000 of identity theft to the pile, Hank would lose everything. The deli would be seized. My mother would be left with nothing. He had engineered a trap so flawless that breaking free required me to destroy my own family. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I muttered a weak apology to the loan officer, snatched my driver license from his desk, and practically ran toward the exit. The heavy glass doors slid open and the freezing Idaho wind hit my face, but it did not clear my head. I stumbled across this icy sidewalk to my parked car. I yanked the door open, threw myself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The silence inside the cold vehicle was deafening. I gripped the steering wheel, staring blindly at the frost on the windshield. The duplicate medical school acceptance letter burned a hole in my coat pocket. I had the ticket out, but the toll was paid in a currency I did not possess. A raw, primal scream tore out of my throat. I brought my fists down on the steering wheel. Hard. The impact reverberated up my arms, but I did not stop. I struck the rigid plastic and leather again and again, punishing the inanimate object for the profound betrayal I could not undo. My father did not just burn a piece of mail. He had orchestrated my ruin years in advance. He tied me to the sinking ship of the North End Deli, knowing I would never have the financial buoyancy to swim away. My breath fogged the cold windows as I continued to strike the wheel. The pain in my hands finally registered, piercing through the fog of my panic. I stopped and looked down. The skin over my knuckles had split open. Dark bruises were already forming under the surface, blending with the red smears of broken skin. I let my head fall forward, resting my forehead against the cold steering wheel. I was trapped. Federal aid would not arrive for months. Private lenders would turn me away the second they pulled my file. The $3,000 deposit was due by Friday, and I possessed exactly $34 in my checking account. My father held all the financial leverage. I sat in the freezing car, nursing my bleeding hands, trying to find a single crack in the walls he had built around me. I needed cash. Fast, untraceable cash that did not require a credit check or a signature. And as the throbbing pain in my hands began to subside, a dangerous, desperate thought crept into my mind, pointing me back to the one person in the deli who kept secrets just as well as my father did. I drove back to the North End Deli with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, my bruised hands throbbing with every turn. The $45,000 of fraudulent commercial debt sat heavy in my chest. My father had effectively neutralized any legal or financial avenue I had to escape. If I reported the identity theft, he went to federal prison. If I stayed silent, I remained locked in his grease-stained prison forever. I needed cash. Unrecorded, untraceable cash. I pushed through the heavy steel back door, and the oppressive heat of the kitchen hit me instantly. The lunch rush had peaked, leaving behind a chaotic mess of discarded butcher paper, spilled mustard, and overflowing trash cans. Hank was at the front counter, arguing loudly with a customer over a disputed catering invoice. His voice boomed across the shop, masking the sound of my return. I slipped past the dishwashing station and ducked into the dry storage pantry. The small windowless room smelled of bulk paprika and stale flour. Before I could turn on the overhead bulb, a hand grabbed my wrist and pulled me deeper into the shadows. I gasped, but a soft, familiar palm clamped over my mouth. It was Susan. My mother stood in the dim light cast by the hallway, her eyes darting nervously toward the open door. She removed her hand from my mouth and pressed a finger to her own lips. Her face was pale, her apron stained with grease and tomato juice. The guilt of scrubbing away the ashes of my acceptance letter clearly weighed heavily on her. She had spent the last 24 hours avoiding my gaze, but now she looked at me with a desperate, fearful resolve. She reached behind a towering stack of industrial-sized tomato paste cans and pulled out a battered wooden cigar box. She cracked the lid open just enough for me to see inside. The box was stuffed with crumpled $10 and $20 bills bound tightly with thick rubber bands. Susan leaned close, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the kitchen. She told me she had been skimming cash from the large catering tips for the last 5 years. Hank never checked the loose change from the delivery orders. She said she was saving it for a rainy day, for an emergency. She looked down at the money, then back up at my bruised knuckles. She told me there was exactly $3,200 in the box. My heart hammered against my ribs. $3,200. It was the exact amount required for the medical school seat deposit, with $200 to spare for gas and food on the drive up to Moscow. I looked at the weathered face of the woman who had surrendered her youth to a meat slicer. She was offering me the only safety net she possessed. She was actively defying her husband to buy my freedom. I reached out and hugged her, gripping her thin shoulders. I felt a soaring rush of profound hope. The trap door was unlocked. Susan shoved the cigar box into my hands and told me to hide it in my car immediately. She said we would figure out the logistics of the deposit transfer after the deli closed tonight. She turned and hurried back toward the front counter, leaving me alone in the dim pantry, clutching the wooden box like a lifeline. I zipped the box inside my winter coat and slipped out the back door, securing the money in the trunk of my rusted sedan. For the first time in days, I could actually picture myself wearing a white coat, standing in a lecture hall, miles away from the smell of pastrami. But hope in the North End deli was always a fragile illusion. 2 hours later, the disaster Hank had been ignoring for months finally arrived. I was wiping down the front display case when a violent mechanical shriek echoed from the back prep area. It sounded like metal grinding against metal, followed by a loud concussive pop that rattled the stainless steel counters. The deli plunged into eerie silence as the constant underlying hum of the kitchen abruptly ceased. Hank froze halfway through slicing a block of sharp provolone. The color drained from his face. He dropped the meat and sprinted down the hallway. I followed him, my pulse quickening. The ancient walk-in freezer, a massive, rusted steel vault dating back to Boise's bygone downtown meatpacking era, stood silent. The heavy compressor unit mounted above the door was hissing violently, spewing a thick cloud of acrid white freon gas into the air. Puddles of dark, oily fluid were already pooling on the tile floor. Hank stared up at this dying machine. His chest heaved as he let out a ragged, wheezing breath. The walk-in freezer held the entire inventory for the upcoming Treefort Music Fest catering orders. Thousands of dollars of premium cured meats, imported cheeses, and delicate produce were locked inside. Without the compressor, the temperature inside the vault would rise rapidly. If the inventory spoiled, the deli could not fulfill the festival contracts. If they defaulted on the contracts, the business would instantly bankrupt. Hank began to panic. He paced the narrow hallway, barking frantic orders at Susan to find industrial fans and bags of ice. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed the emergency commercial refrigeration repair service, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the phone twice. He screamed into the receiver, demanding a technician arrive immediately. 20 minutes later, a repair van screeched into the alleyway. A technician hauled a heavy tool bag into the kitchen and climbed a ladder to inspect the smoking compressor. Hank and Susan stood below, watching him with agonizing tension. After 10 minutes of probing and testing, the technician climbed down and wiped his hands on a rag. He delivered the fatal verdict. The compressor coil was completely blown. The entire unit required a specialized replacement part. Hank demanded the technician fix it immediately. The technician shook his head and explained the harsh reality of emergency commercial repairs. He said he had the part in his truck, but the replacement and the emergency labor fee would cost $3,000. Due to the Deli's history of late payments, his company required the fee up front in cash or a certified cashier check before he would turn a single wrench. Hank pulled out his wallet and ripped through his credit cards. He shoved them at the technician, begging him to run the numbers. The technician sighed and ran the cards through his mobile terminal one by one. Declined, declined, declined. The $45,000 of fraudulent debt had maxed out every hidden avenue of credit Hank possessed. Hank slumped against the wall, clutching his chest. He looked at Susan, his eyes wild and defeated. He told her the meat was going to rot. He said the deli was finished. He looked like a man watching his entire life turn to ash. Susan stood frozen. She looked at her broken, panicking husband, and then she looked at me standing near the pantry door. The silence in the kitchen stretched taut and heavy. I saw the terrifying realization dawn in her eyes. I knew exactly what she was weighing in her mind. Would you let your family starve today to feed your own tomorrow? Susan closed her eyes, taking a deep, trembling breath. She turned away from me and walked briskly out the back door toward the alley. My stomach dropped. I followed her outside, watching in silent horror as she opened the trunk of my car. She reached inside and pulled out the battered wooden cigar box. I stepped forward, my voice cracking as I begged her to stop. I told her that money was my future. I reminded her she gave it to me. Susan did not look at me. She hugged the wooden box to her chest, her knuckles white. She whispered that she was sorry. She said she could not let Hank lose the business. She said the deli fed us all. She turned her back on me and walked back into the kitchen, carrying my medical school deposit directly to the repair technician. I stood in the freezing alleyway entirely gutted. The betrayal was absolute. My mother had just traded my freedom to fix a broken refrigerator. I followed her back inside. The technician was counting the crumpled bills, nodding his approval. Hank was crying, weeping with relief as he hugged Susan, kissing her cheek and praising her for saving their livelihood. They stood together, a unified front, locked inside their miserable, grease-stained survival loop. I felt a cold, dark rage rise from the bottom of my stomach. I did not walk away quietly. I approached my mother as the technician climbed back up the ladder. I did not care that Hank was standing right there. I looked at Susan and stripped away every ounce of respect a daughter owes a mother. I called her a coward. I spat the words with deliberate venom. I told her she was a spineless, pathetic shell of a woman who was too terrified of her own husband to stand up for her child. I screamed that she deserved the smell of bleach and rotting meat. I told her she deserved every miserable, exhausting day she spent trapped behind that counter because she actively chose her prison over my freedom. The words were cruel and sharp, designed to inflict permanent damage. Susan's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand, sobbing silently as my insults landed like physical blows. Hank stepped forward, raising his hand to defend his wife, but I did not back down. I glared at him, my chest heaving, daring him to speak. I knew I was being vicious. I knew I was burning the last bridge I had left in that kitchen, but the pain of the theft blinded my rationality. I turned on my heel and shoved the heavy steel door open, fleeing the deli and leaving my shattered parents standing in the wreckage of our family. I had no money. I had no allies. I had 48 hours to secure $3,000 and confront a medical admissions board located 300 miles away. The walls had completely closed in, leaving only one desperate, dangerous option remaining. I stood in the freezing alleyway behind the deli, my breath pluming in the icy air. My mother had just handed my deposit money to a refrigeration mechanic to save the family business. I wanted to get into my rusted sedan and drive until the gas tank hit empty, but I could not leave. The $45,000 of fraudulent commercial debt tied around my neck like a concrete block demanded a reckoning. I pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped back into the suffocating heat of the kitchen. Hank was wiping down the stainless steel prep table, a look of profound relief washing over his tired features. The hum of the repaired compressor vibrated through the floorboards, drowning out the ambient noise of the street outside. I marched straight toward him, the duplicate medical school acceptance letter burning a hole in my pocket. I did not yell. My voice was dangerously quiet when I asked him how long he thought he could hide the equipment loans he took out in my name. Hank froze. The rag slipped from his hand, hitting the greasy tile with a wet slap. He tried to feign ignorance, but the guilt was written plainly across his pale face. I pressed forward, demanding to know how he could steal my Social Security number to buy meat slicers and ovens. I told him the credit union loan officer laughed at me when I applied for a bridge loan. Hank stepped back, rubbing his left shoulder. His breathing grew shallow. He did not apologize. Instead, he launched into a desperate defense. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice rising in volume. He told me I knew nothing about survival. He told me about the day the bank foreclosed on his father's farm in the Owyhee foothills. He was just a teenager standing in the dry dust, watching men in tailored suits repossess the tractors and the livestock. He saw his own father break down and cry in the dirt, stripped of his dignity by institutional debt. Hank swore he would never let a bank dictate his family survival again. He used my name because his credit was ruined, keeping a roof over my head. In his twisted mind, stealing my identity was an act of paternal protection. He genuinely believed he was sparing me from the humiliation his own father endured. I listened to his tragic justification and felt zero sympathy. I told him his childhood trauma did not give him the right to destroy my future. I told him he was a parasite feeding off his own daughter to keep a failing sandwich shop alive. I stepped closer, backing him against the broken display case. I promised him I would file a formal police report for identity theft and watch him go to federal prison if he did not find a way to fix my credit immediately. Hank opened his mouth to shout back, but the words never came. His face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He grabbed his chest, his fingers curling into the stained fabric of his white apron. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of the counter. A harsh, wheezing gasp tore from his throat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with sudden, agonizing terror. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching his left arm, his body twisting in pain. The kitchen fell into a horrifying silence, broken only by the hum of the newly repaired freezer. Susan screamed from the front register, dropping a stack of paper cups and sprinting down the hallway. I stood frozen, looking down at the man who had systematically ruined my life. If your captor is dying on the floor, do you run or do you perform CPR? For 10 agonizing seconds, I did not move. I watched him struggle to draw air into his lungs. A dark, terrifying thought crept into my mind. If his heart stopped, the fraudulent debt would fall into probate. The anchor would shatter. I would be free. I let that toxic thought bloom in my chest while my father gasped for his life on the dirty linoleum. The sheer malice of my own hesitation sickened me. I will carry the guilt of those 10 seconds to my grave. My dormant medical training finally overrode my resentment. I dropped to my knees beside him, shoving the scattered debris out of the way. I checked his airway and felt for a pulse. It was thready and erratic. I yelled at Susan to call emergency services. I loosened his tight collar, keeping him flat on his back while monitoring his shallow breaths. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet Boise afternoon. Paramedics stormed through the back alley doors, hauling a stretcher and heavy medical bags. They pushed me aside, attaching electrodes to his chest and shouting a barrage of clinical terms. They loaded him onto the stretcher and rushed him out into the biting cold. Susan followed them, sobbing into her apron. I stood alone in the empty deli, staring at the spot on the tile where my father had just collapsed. The drive to St. Luke's Regional Medical Center in downtown Boise was a blur. I navigated the icy streets mechanically, my brain oscillating between clinical diagnosis and profound emotional shock. I parked in the concrete parking structure and ran through the sterile sliding glass doors. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency wing offered no comfort. Susan was sitting in a plastic chair in the waiting area, her face buried in her hands. A cardiac specialist emerged from the double doors, looking grave but composed. He informed us that Hank had suffered a stress-induced heart attack. They had stabilized him with medication, and he was resting in the cardiac intensive care unit. The doctor warned that Hank needed immediate rest and a strict elimination of workplace stress to survive the week. I walked into the intensive care room and looked at my father. He lay in the narrow hospital bed, hooked up to monitors that beeped a steady rhythmic cadence. He looked incredibly small, frail, and terrifyingly mortal. The domineering tyrant who burned my medical school letter and stole my financial identity was gone. In his place was a broken aging man fighting for his next breath. A fresh wave of tears spilled down my cheeks. I hated him for what he had done to me, but the deep primal trauma bond of a daughter, terrified of losing her father, anchored me to the floor. I reached out and touched his cold hand. His skin felt like paper. He did not open his eyes. I stood by his bedside, trapped between furious resentment and devastating grief. My escape plan was rapidly dissolving into the sterile hospital air. Susan stepped into the room, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. She looked at Hank, and then at me, her expression tight with anxiety. She whispered that the hospital billing department needed Hank's updated health insurance information to process the emergency admission. She told me the insurance documents were locked inside the heavy floor safe hidden beneath the desk in the Deli back office. She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a heavy ring of brass keys. She begged me to go back to the shop to retrieve the paperwork before the billing office flagged his account. I looked at my mother, wiping my tired eyes. The medical board appeal was slipping further away with every passing hour. I took the keys from her shaking hands and turned toward the door. I walked out of the hospital unaware that opening my father's hidden safe would reveal a secret capable of changing the entire trajectory of my life. The drive away from St. Luke's Regional Medical Center felt like moving underwater. The heater in my rusted sedan rattled, blowing lukewarm air against my frozen hands. The afternoon sky over Boise had turned a bruised shade of violet, casting long shadows across the snow-banked sidewalks. I navigated the quiet streets on autopilot, my mind trapped in the sterile intensive care unit with my father. Just minutes ago, I stood over his hospital bed, terrified of losing him. Now I was holding the keys to his business, returning to the scene of my own destruction to retrieve a piece of paper that would pay his medical bills. I parked in the alleyway behind the North End Deli. The brick walls stood silent and imposing in the fading light. Turning the heavy brass key in the deadbolt, I pushed the steel door open and stepped inside. The air in the kitchen was thick and stagnant. Without the usual cacophony of shouting vendors, ringing registers, and humming meat slicers, the space felt like an abandoned tomb. The lingering acrid scent of the leaked Freon mingled heavily with the familiar odors of garlic-dried oregano and stale sourdough. It was a suffocating perfume. Walking down the narrow hallway, I felt a profound sense of isolation. The deli was a monument to my family's survival, but it had demanded my future as the entry fee. I reached the cramped back office. The room was a windowless closet packed with towering filing cabinets and cardboard boxes overflowing with unpaid invoices. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting a harsh yellow glare over the cluttered mahogany desk. Susan had whispered the safe combination to me in the hospital corridor, her voice shaking with residual panic. I pushed the heavy rolling chair out of the way and pulled back the faded utility rug covering the center of the room. A square steel plate sat flush with the cold concrete floor. I knelt down, the chill seeping through my jeans, and grabbed the recessed handle, pulling the cover aside to reveal a heavy brass dial. I took a shaky breath and focused on the numbers. 3 full turns to the right, 2 turns left past 0, 1 sharp turn back to the right. A deep metallic clunk echoed from the mechanism, echoing off the concrete walls. I gripped the thick handle and pulled upward, hauling the heavy steel door open on its well-oiled hinges. A wave of stale air drifted up from the dark cavity, smelling of old paper and tarnished metal. I reached inside, expecting to find a simple plastic folder containing insurance cards and business licenses. Instead, my fingers brushed against several heavy cloth pouches. I pulled one out and loosened the drawstrings. A pile of tarnished Morgan silver dollars spilled into my palm, clinking together with a dull, heavy sound. Hank hoarded them as a physical hedge against disaster. Beneath the coins, I found a stack of brittle yellow documents. I unfolded one carefully. It was a property deed to a defunct mining claim up in the Silver Valley, an old stretch of land in the northern Panhandle. My grandfather had purchased the claims decades ago, hoping to strike a rich vein of lead or silver. He found nothing but rocks and debt. Hank kept the worthless deeds locked in his floor safe as a permanent grim reminder of how easily a family could lose everything to an institutional gamble. I dug deeper into the dark recess, pushing aside a stack of old tax returns to locate the health insurance folder. My fingers caught on the edge of a thick manila envelope wedged tightly into the back corner of the steel box. It was sealed with a wound-red string and covered in a thick layer of dust indicating it had not been touched in years. A strange prickle of curiosity ran down my arms. I pulled the envelope out and untied the delicate string. I slid the contents onto the edge of the mahogany desk. It was not a deed or a tax form. It was a single crisp sheet of heavy, intricate paper bearing the official seal of the United States Treasury, a Series EE savings bond. My eyes scanned the elegant printed text, looking for the issuer details. The bond was purchased 24 years ago. The designated beneficiary name printed in bold black ink was mine, Emily. I looked at the denomination printed in the top corner, $4,000. My breath caught in my throat. $4,000. It was more than enough to cover the required medical school seat deposit. It was more than enough to buy my freedom. I flipped the bond over. Attached to the back was a small, faded yellow sticky note. The handwriting was unmistakable. The sharp, slanted script belonged to Hank. The ink was faded, but the words remained clear and legible. For Emily's college. I stared at the sticky note, my mind struggling to process the conflicting reality sitting on the desk. He had the money. He possessed the exact funds I needed to save my admission to the WWAMI program. When I was crying on the kitchen floor, when my credit application was rejected, when he burned my acceptance letter in the sink, he knew this envelope was sitting at the bottom of the safe. He had hidden my salvation beneath a pile of worthless silver and failed dreams. What is worse, someone who never loved you, or someone whose love looks exactly like a cage? Hank did not hate me. He bought this bond when I was a newborn with the genuine intention of funding my education. But over the decades, his terrifying fear of losing control had warped his love into something dark and suffocating. He decided that allowing me to leave and pursue a demanding career would end in the same catastrophic failure his own father experienced in the Silver Valley. He locked the bond away, convincing himself he was protecting me from the harsh world by keeping me chained to a meat slicer. His protective instincts were a toxic venom that paralyzed my entire life. A hot, fierce energy flooded my veins, replacing the cold shock with a blinding rush of betrayal. The cognitive dissonance of his buried affection and his active sabotage felt like a physical blow to the chest. I grabbed the savings bond and the insurance folder, shoving them into my coat pocket. I stood up, kicking the heavy rolling chair backward. It slammed against the filing cabinet with a loud metallic crash. I stormed out of the tiny office, marching down the hallway and stepping into the main kitchen. The stainless steel prep tables mocked me, gleaming under the harsh lights. The shelves were lined with bulk ingredients, holding the inventory that dictated my every waking hour. I saw a large glass jar of stone, ground gourmet mustard sitting on the edge of the prep station. I grabbed the heavy glass jar, my fingers wrapping tight around the metal lid. I did not think about the mess. I did not care about the cost. I hurled the jar across the room with every ounce of strength I possessed. The glass struck the exposed brick wall above the dishwashing sink. It shattered with a sharp, explosive crack, sending sharp fragments and thick yellow mustard exploding across the masonry. The condiment dripped down the brick, staining the clean white grout. The physical release of throwing the jar broke the dam, holding back my emotions. I collapsed against the edge of the prep table, burying my face in my hands and weeping. I cried for the years of lost sleep. I cried for the bruised knuckles from punching my steering wheel. I cried for the profound, tragic reality that my father was both my generous benefactor and my cruelest warden. My tears felt hot and heavy, soaking into the sleeves of my winter coat as I stood amid the quiet wreckage of the deli. I stayed in the kitchen for several long minutes, allowing the storm of grief to wash over me. When my breathing finally steadied, I wiped my face with a paper towel and retrieved the savings bond from my pocket. I needed to understand the logistics of cashing the document. I read the fine print on the back of the Treasury paper. Because the bond was purchased when I was an infant, it was registered as a custodial account. To cash the mature bond without triggering a lengthy fraud investigation or waiting months for a bureaucratic override, I needed the listed custodian to sign the release line. The custodian was Hank. I traced my thumb over the signature line. The realization settled into my bones with a cold, heavy clarity. I did not need to forge his name and risk a felony charge. I did not need to steal the document in the dark. I held a piece of federal paper that belonged to me, and I held the ultimate leverage to force his hand. Gary the postman had filed a formal report with the postal inspector for the tampered mail. If Hank refused to sign the release line on the bond, I would use that federal report to initiate a criminal investigation. I walked toward the back door, my steps firm and measured. I locked the deadbolt behind me, stepping back into the freezing alleyway. I had the insurance documents Susan requested, but I also carried the key to my escape. I was heading back to the sterile corridors of St. Luke's Hospital. I was going to stand over my father's bed, look him in the eye, and demand he hand over my future in the bright, unflinching light of day. The automatic doors of St. Luke's Regional Medical Center slid open, welcoming me into a blinding wash of clinical white light. The sharp scent of iodine and sterilized linoleum instantly replaced the heavy aroma of stale sourdough and crushed mustard that clung to my winter coat. I walked through the quiet lobby, my boots squeaking faintly against the polished floor. Every step felt like wading through wet cement. I held the health insurance folder in my left hand. In my right pocket, my fingers traced the crisp edge of the Series EE savings bond. My mother was not in the intensive care waiting room when I stepped off the elevator. A nurse at the desk told me Susan had gone down to the ground floor cafeteria to get a cup of black coffee and a moment of peace. That left me alone. I walked down the hushed corridor toward room 412. The rhythmic electronic chime of a cardiac monitor bled through the partially open door. I pushed the heavy door wide and stepped inside. The stark, sterile environment of the hospital room presented a jarring contrast to the greasy, chaotic world my father usually commanded. There were no stainless steel prep tables to hide behind, no roaring industrial ovens to drown out the silence. Hank lay flat on his back wearing a faded hospital gown that swallowed his frame. Transparent tubes snaked across his pale skin, delivering oxygen and fluids. He looked incredibly diminished, a fragile mortal man, rather than the looming tyrant who dictated my every waking moment. But as I approached the bed, his eyes fluttered open, and that familiar stubborn glint hardened his features. He saw me, and his jaw tightened. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not apologize for the screaming match that put him in this bed. He simply extended his unhooked hand and demanded the insurance paperwork. I handed him the plain manila folder. He leafed through the documents with a scowl, satisfied that his medical bills would be covered. He let out a harsh, dry cough and told me to get back to the deli to help my mother close up the shop. He spoke with the same careless authority he always used, expecting me to pivot on my heel and march back to the meat slicer. I did not move. I stood at the edge of his bed, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the dusty envelope containing the Treasury bond. I placed it on the narrow plastic tray table swung across his lap. Would you use the federal government to break your father's heart if it meant saving your own life? Hank glanced down at the official Treasury seal. His eyes widened, a flicker of genuine alarm piercing his gruff exterior. He recognized the heavy parchment immediately. He reached out to snatch it away, but I pulled the document back, keeping it just out of his reach. I told him I needed him to sign the custodial release line. I told him the $4,000 would cover my medical school seat deposit and the travel expenses for my admissions appeal. His face flushed a dangerous shade of red, despite the heart medication pumping through his veins. He struggled to prop himself up on his elbows, his voice raspy but dripping with contempt. He told me to put the paper away. He insisted that money was an emergency fund for the family, not a handout for a foolish pipe dream. He ordered me to return the bond to the safe and forget I ever saw it. He tried to wield his parental authority, wielding guilt and obligation like blunt instruments. He reminded me of the roof over my head, the food on my plate, the sacrifices he made to keep the business running. I did not deliver a smooth, cinematic monologue to shut him down. My body betrayed my terror. A violent tremor seized my shoulders, traveling down my arms. I reached out and gripped the cold metal bed rail to keep my knees from buckling beneath me. The bruised, broken skin on my knuckles throbbed, radiating sharp pain up my wrists, but I welcomed the physical sting. It kept me grounded in the room. I stuttered, my voice cracking under the immense pressure of the moment. I told him the pipe dream was the only thing keeping me breathing. I told him I knew about the $45,000 of commercial equipment debt he secretly placed in my name. Hank flinched, falling back against his pillows. He opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but I cut him off. My grip on the bed rail tightened, my knuckles turning white. I forced the words past the tight lump in my throat, refusing to let him control the narrative. I laid out the reality of his situation without shouting. I explained that Gary the postman saw him dump the burned remnants of my medical school acceptance letter into the alleyway trash. I watched the blood drain entirely from my father's face as I mentioned Gary's name. I told Hank the postman did not just fish the letter out of the garbage. He drove downtown to the Federal Postal Inspection Office. He filed a sworn formal report and handed over the charred evidence to a federal agent. The silence in the room grew suffocating, broken only by the erratic, spiking tempo of the cardiac monitor. Hank understood the mechanics of the law well enough to recognize a fatal blow. Destroying another person's mail was not a domestic dispute. It was a federal felony. The very institutions he spent his entire life fearing, the banks, the government, the distant authorities holding the power to seize his property, were now knocking at his door. And he had invited them in through his own desperate need for control. I looked down at the man who had terrified me for 24 years. He looked like a cornered animal. I played my final card, leaning closer to the bed. I told him that if he signed the custodial release on the savings bond, I would take the money and leave for Moscow, Idaho tonight. I promised I would use part of those funds to hire a lawyer to mitigate the federal fallout from the postal investigation. I told him I would decline to press fraud charges regarding the identity theft, protecting the Deli from asset seizure. I offered him a brutal, agonizing trade. He had to finance my escape, or I would step aside and let the federal government dismantle his entire life. Tears welled in his eyes, spilling over his weathered cheeks. It was not a beautiful, dignified cry. It was a pathetic, wheezing sob. The realization of his profound failure crashed down upon him. His suffocating grip had not kept his family safe. It had triggered his ultimate nightmare. He had driven his only daughter to the absolute limit, forcing her to hold a gun to his legacy just to secure her basic freedom. He wept into his hands, his chest heaving under the thin hospital gown. I stood there watching my father break, and I felt no triumph. I felt an exhausting, hollow grief. I slid the treasury bond and a blue ink pen onto his tray table. I told him to sign the paper. Hank picked up the pen with a trembling hand. He did not look at me. He stared blankly at the signature line, the fight completely drained from his spirit. He scratched his name across the bottom of the document, the ink jagged and uneven, marking the official surrender of his control over my life. I pulled the signed document from the table and folded it carefully, sliding it back into my coat pocket. I did not offer him words of comfort. I did not tell him I loved him. The damage between us was too vast, too deeply rooted to bridge with a hollow farewell. I turned my back on the hospital bed and walked toward the door, the heavy weight of the unsaid words pressing against my spine. I stepped out into the hallway just as Susan emerged from the elevator holding a steaming paper cup of coffee. She looked at my face, reading the grim resolution etched into my features. She asked me what happened. I told her Hank had signed the bond and I was leaving for the university. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare set of keys to the family sedan. I told my mother I needed to drive back to the house to pack my bags, and I would be taking the car for the drive up north. Susan nodded weakly, too exhausted to argue, offering no resistance, as I walked past her toward the exit. I strode through the hospital lobby, the signed treasury bond sitting heavy against my chest. I had the funds to secure my seat deposit. I had the means to transport myself to the appeals hearing. I believed the hardest part of the battle was finally behind me. I had forced the warden to hand over the keys to my cell, but I underestimated the sheer spite of a man stripped of his power. I did not know that, as I drove away to pack my meager belongings, my father was reaching for the bedside telephone, preparing to dial a number that would sever my escape route, leaving me stranded in the freezing mountains with a target on my back. I shoved my clothes into a cheap canvas duffel bag, tearing hangers from the closet rod and leaving the empty plastic hooks swinging. I did not fold anything. The urgency pumping through my blood demanded speed over neatness. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the buzzing, chaotic rhythm of the deli. I grabbed my worn winter boots and a heavy wool scarf, zipping the bag shut. I drove straight to the bank, presenting the signed treasury bond and securing a cashier's check for the exact amount of the medical school seat deposit. The teller handed me the printed slip of paper, and I felt a profound, soaring rush of momentum. The locks were broken. The gate was open. I just needed to reach the finish line. I merged onto Highway 55, heading north out of the Treasure Valley. The sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the winding mountain passes into a deep, frigid twilight. The road was a treacherous ribbon of asphalt, cutting through the rugged Idaho wilderness, flanked by towering snow-laden pines and steep rocky drop-offs. The heater in the rusted sedan blasted hot, dry air against my face, keeping the biting cold at bay. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of the tires against the icy pavement. I was finally moving. I was outrunning the smell of bleach and the weight of $45,000 in fraudulent debt. I was driving toward a clean slate. But how do you outrun a man who holds the title to your only escape route? The flashing red and blue lights erupted in my rearview mirror, illuminating the dark cabin of the car. My stomach performed a violent lurching drop. I checked the speedometer. I was traveling exactly the posted limit, taking the treacherous curves with extreme caution. I activated my turn signal and pulled the sedan onto a narrow, snow-packed turnout at the edge of the Payette River. The police cruiser pulled up behind me, casting a harsh, strobing glare across the snowbanks. I rolled down the window, the freezing air biting at my cheeks. A local county sheriff approached the vehicle, shining a bright flashlight into the cabin. He asked for my license and registration, his tone neutral and professional. I handed over my driver license and reached into the glove compartment, pulling out the folded vehicle registration. The officer examined the documents, his flashlight beam tracing the printed text. He looked at me, his expression shifting from routine inquiry to cautious protocol. "Emily," he said, his breath forming white clouds in the cold air. "The registration for this vehicle lists Hank as the primary owner." I nodded, explaining that Hank was my father. I told him I was borrowing the car to drive up to the university in Moscow for a mandatory academic hearing. The officer sighed a heavy, tired sound that signaled impending trouble. He handed my license back but kept the registration slip. He told me the vehicle had been reported stolen 45 minutes ago. He said the registered owner placed a call to the dispatch center, claiming the car was taken without permission and requesting an immediate intercept. The words slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Stolen. My father, lying in a hospital bed recovering from a cardiac event, had reached for his bedside telephone and filed a false police report. Stripped of his leverage in the hospital room, he lashed out with pure, spiteful desperation. He knew I needed the vehicle to reach the appeals committee. He knew the title was in his name. He weaponized the law using the very institutions he despised to drag me back to the deli. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I begged the officer to call the hospital. I told him my father was a controlling tyrant trying to sabotage my medical school admission. I explained about the burned acceptance letter and the impending federal postal investigation. My words spilled out in a frantic, chaotic rush. The officer held up his hand, stopping my frantic explanation. He looked at me with genuine sympathy. He said he believed my story, recognizing the classic hallmarks of a domestic dispute. But he explained the grim reality of the law. As a sworn officer, he was legally bound to enforce the registered title. Because my name was not on the document, he could not allow me to drive the vehicle away. He informed me he had to impound the sedan and wait for a tow truck. The dam holding back my panic shattered. I pushed the car door open, forcing the officer to take a step back. I stepped out onto the frozen shoulder, the icy wind cutting through my thin sweater. I did not maintain a calm, rational demeanor. I lost my temper entirely. I screamed at the officer, my voice cracking under the immense strain of the betrayal. I cursed at him, spitting harsh, venomous words that echoed off the surrounding pine trees. I demanded he let me back into the driver's seat, threatening to file a complaint for harassment. I pointed a trembling finger at his badge, blaming him for enforcing a corrupt system that empowered abusers. My outburst was vicious, misdirected, and entirely useless. The officer stood firm, refusing to engage with my hysteria. He calmly instructed me to retrieve my personal belongings from the vehicle. His quiet professionalism only fueled my helpless rage. I realized shouting would not change the ink on the registration title. The law was deaf to my context. I slumped against the side of the impounded car, burying my face in my hands. The fight drained out of my muscles, leaving me hollow and shivering. I wept into the freezing night air, my tears turning cold against my skin. I reached into the back seat and grabbed my canvas duffel bag, hauling it out onto the snowy shoulder. I reached into the glove box and retrieved the cashier's check and the duplicate WDUWAMI acceptance letter, clutching the precious documents to my chest. A heavy flatbed tow truck rumbled around the mountain bend, its amber lights flashing against the tree line. It pulled onto the turnout, the hydraulic winch whining as the driver positioned the rig. I stood in the knee-deep snow, watching the heavy chains hook onto the front axle of my family sedan. The winch groaned, pulling my only means of transportation onto the tilted steel bed. The police officer offered to drive me to a nearby diner to wait out the freezing temperatures. I ignored him, refusing to get into the back of his cruiser. I grabbed my duffel bag and began walking down the dark, icy shoulder toward the distant glow of a highway gas station. I heard the tow truck engine roar, hauling my car back down the mountain toward Boise. I was stranded in the rural Idaho wilderness, hours away from the university campus. The appeals hearing was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. If I did not stand in front of that medical board and present the deposit check, my spot would be permanently forfeited. My father had successfully severed my transportation, ensuring I would fail by default. I trudged through the snow, the biting wind slicing through my coat, wondering how I was going to cross 300 miles of frozen asphalt before the sun came up. I needed a miracle, but I was about to discover that salvation sometimes arrives wrapped in the cynical opportunism of a bitter rival. The flashing neon sign of the highway gas station buzzed a frantic, erratic rhythm, cutting through the pitch-black Idaho night. I stumbled through the automatic doors, my boots leaving wet, snowy tracks across the cheap linoleum floor. The cashier, a teenager with heavy eyeliner and a bored expression, barely looked up from her phone. I bought a stale coffee with the loose change clinking at the bottom of my purse, wrapping my bruised, frozen hands around the flimsy paper cup. I had no car. I had $40 to my name. I was standing 50 miles outside of Boise and 250 miles away from the university campus in Moscow. I asked the cashier if there was a local taxi service that ran this late. She snorted, pushing her phone across the counter. She told me the only thing moving up the mountain tonight was the long-haul trucking route and the midnight Greyhound bus making its final regional sweep. She pointed to a faded, laminated schedule taped to the plexiglass divider. The last northbound bus departed from the downtown Boise station in exactly 90 minutes. I hitched a ride back into the city with a sympathetic dairy farmer driving a battered pickup truck. He smelled like hay and diesel fuel, keeping the radio tuned to a low, crackling country station. He dropped me off at the curb outside the Greyhound terminal. The building was a brutalist concrete block sitting on the edge of the downtown grid. The transient atmosphere inside was thick and suffocating, smelling of cheap floor wax, wet wool, and lingering despair. People slept slumped over plastic chairs, clutching their duffel bags like life rafts. I checked the departure board glowing above the ticketing counter. The overnight express to Moscow was boarding in 20 minutes. A one-way ticket cost $75. I dumped the contents of my purse onto a sticky metal table near the vending machines. I counted the crumpled bills and the assorted silver coins 3 times, hoping I had miscalculated. I had $43.12. The cashier check for the medical school deposit sat safely in my inner coat pocket, but it was made out to the university. I could not cash it. I leaned against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. My father had won. He stranded me in the mountains, forced me back to the city, and drained my resources. I pulled my knees to my chest, staring blindly at the scuffed toe of my winter boot. A pair of polished leather loafers stepped into my line of sight. I looked up, tracing the sharp crease of tailored trousers to a heavy wool overcoat. Marcus stood over me, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. Marcus owned the gourmet sandwich shop 3 blocks away from the North End Deli. He catered to the gentrifying demographic of Boise, serving artisanal focaccia and imported prosciutto at a staggering markup. He despised Hank. The feeling was mutual. Hank viewed Marcus as an arrogant interloper ruining the neighborhood aesthetic, while Marcus viewed Hank as a stubborn relic occupying prime real estate. They fought over local suppliers' parking spaces and catering contracts with a petty, vicious intensity. Marcus looked down at my duffel bag and my bruised, tear-stained face. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Emily," he said, his tone laced with a sharp, calculating curiosity. "You look like a refugee. Did your old man finally kick you out of the grease trap?" I did not have the energy to defend my family honor. I stared at his polished shoes and admitted I was trying to reach the university in Moscow for a medical school hearing. I told him my father reported my car stolen to stop me. I confessed I was $30 short for the bus ticket. Marcus let out a short, barking laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. He did not offer a sympathetic smile. He did not pat my shoulder or offer empty platitudes. He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and held it out between his index and middle finger. "Is it really help if it is handed to you by your family's worst enemy?" I stared at the money, my stomach churning with humiliation. Taking cash from my father's fiercest rival felt like a profound structural betrayal. It violated every unspoken rule of loyalty I had been raised to uphold. I hesitated, my hands remaining firmly in my lap. Marcus sighed, crouching down to my eye level. He pushed the bill closer, tapping it against my knee. He did not pretend he was performing a charitable act of kindness. He looked me in the eye and delivered a brutally honest assessment of my family business. "Take the money, Emily," he ordered, his voice low and precise. "I know exactly how Hank keeps his margins afloat. He relies entirely on your free labor to avoid paying market wages for a prep cook and a manager. If you get on that bus tonight and leave the North End Deli, he loses his most valuable asset. The stress will break him, and the overhead will bankrupt him within a year." He smiled a sharp, predatory expression. "I am not buying your freedom. I am investing in his collapse. Buy the ticket. Put him out of his misery so I can buy his lease." The cynical opportunism of his offer was staggering. He was weaponizing my escape to destroy my father's legacy. I looked at the $100 bill, then up at the departure board flashing the final boarding call for the Moscow route. My pride screamed at me to reject the money to stand up and walk away. But pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had to swallow the bitter, humiliating reality that my salvation was built on the calculated destruction of my own family. I snatched the bill from his hand, ignoring his smug smile. I grabbed my duffel bag and marched to the ticketing counter, slapping the cash onto the linoleum. I purchased the non-refundable overnight pass, sprinting out to the loading bay just as the driver began closing the heavy pneumatic doors. The 8-hour bus ride up the winding mountain corridor was a grueling, claustrophobic nightmare. The cabin was overheated, smelling of stale diesel fumes and unwashed bodies. I jammed myself into a narrow window seat, clutching my duffel bag to my chest. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical weight, pulling my eyelids down. I tried to stay awake to review my arguments for the appeals committee, but the exhaustion dragged me under. I fell into a deep, fitful sleep. My head lolled sideways, hitting the shoulder of the passenger sitting next to me. It was an older man wearing a heavy flannel jacket. I woke up with a sharp jolt hours later, deeply disoriented and shivering. A cold, wet patch of drool stained the collar of the stranger's coat. I wiped my mouth frantically, apologizing profusely while my cheeks burned with intense mortification. The man grunted and shifted away, pulling his collar up to his ears. I slumped back against the window, staring out at the pitch-black forest whizzing past the glass. I smelled like stale deli meat, dried sweat, and cheap coffee. I was bruised, exhausted, and traveling on the dime of a man plotting my father's ruin. I did not look like a polished, promising medical student. I looked like a desperate fugitive. The bus rumbled onward, carrying me toward the academic judgment that would determine the rest of my life. I had the deposit check and the duplicate letter, but I was about to walk into a sterile boardroom filled with elite physicians who did not care about the messy, violent mechanics of my survival. They only cared about liability, and I was bringing a massive storm directly to their doorstep. The Greyhound bus hissed and groaned as it pulled into the transit center in Moscow, Idaho. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the rolling hills of the Palouse, casting a pale, freezing light across the sprawling campus of the University of Idaho. I stepped off the bus, my legs stiff and aching from the 8-hour cramped journey. The biting northern wind hit me instantly, carrying the faint scent of the surrounding agricultural fields and frozen pine. I tightened my wool scarf, dragging my cheap canvas duffel bag across the icy pavement toward the administration building. The campus architecture was a striking blend of practical agricultural facilities and imposing brick Gothic structures. Tall, arched windows and heavy masonry projected an aura of elite academic tradition that felt entirely alien to my grease-stained reality. I navigated the labyrinthine pathways, locating the WWAMI Regional Medical Program headquarters, housed inside a sterile modern annex. I pushed through the heavy glass doors into a lobby that smelled of expensive carpet cleaner and quiet ambition. I checked my reflection in the polished, mirrored surface of a hallway vending machine. I looked terrible. My eyes were bloodshot, shadowed by deep purple bags of exhaustion. My hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and my clothes hung wrinkled on my frame. I tried to smooth the creases from my sweater, taking deep, shaky breaths to steady my racing pulse. I reached into my coat pocket, verifying the cashier's check and the duplicate acceptance letter were still safe. I walked to the reception desk, requesting access to the scheduled appeals hearing. A crisp, efficient secretary directed me down a long, silent corridor to a heavy oak door marked Committee Room B. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside. The room was intimidatingly formal. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center, flanked by high-backed leather chairs. 3 physicians sat on the opposite side, reviewing thick manila folders. The man sitting in the center chair commanded the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris Thorne, the Regional Director of Admissions. He wore a sharply tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his expression an impenetrable mask of clinical detachment. To his right sat a younger female physician, furiously taking notes on a laptop. To his left sat an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, who did not look up from my file when I entered. Dr. Thorne gestured to a solitary wooden chair placed at the opposite end of the long table. "Take a seat, Emily," he instructed, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. "We have a brief window to review your appeal regarding the missed enrollment deadline. Please explain why you failed to submit your confirmation and why this committee should reinstate your admission over the current waitlisted candidate. We are taught that the truth will set us free, but what if the truth just makes you a liability?" I gripped the edges of the wooden chair, grounding myself in the physical reality of the room. I laid the cashier's check and the duplicate acceptance letter on the polished table, pushing them forward. I did not attempt to mask the chaos of my situation. I delivered the raw, unvarnished truth, hoping my honesty would bridge the gap between my disheveled appearance and their elite standards. I explained how my father deliberately intercepted and burned my original acceptance letter to keep me working at his deli. I described the $45,000 of fraudulent commercial debt he hid under my Social Security number, sabotaging my ability to secure a standard bridge loan. I told them about the treasury bond my grandfather left me, how I had to force my father to sign the release from a hospital bed, and how he retaliated by reporting my car stolen to strand me in the mountains. I detailed the harrowing 8-hour bus ride funded by a bitter rival. I laid my entire violent, messy survival story bare before the committee. I waited for the wave of cinematic sympathy. I expected Dr. Thorne to soften his sharp gaze to acknowledge my grit and commend my resilience. I waited for the dramatic turning point where my hardship became the exact reason they welcomed me into their ranks. The turning point never arrived. Dr. Thorne steepled his fingers, resting his chin on his hands. He looked at my cashier's check, then back up at my face. His expression remained entirely unmoved. The older physician to his left adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. Emily. Dr. Thorne began his tone cool and measured. Your MCAT scores are exceptional. Your undergraduate academic record demonstrates a high capacity for retaining complex information. However, the practice of medicine requires more than intellectual aptitude. It requires profound emotional and logistical stability. He leaned forward, tapping a pen against my file. The WWAMI program is an intense, rigorous crucible. We routinely see brilliant students break under the academic pressure alone. You are asking us to reinstate a candidate who is currently embroiled in severe ongoing familial trauma. You have detailed active identity theft, a pending federal postal investigation involving your father, and a severe lack of reliable transportation or financial safety nets. The female physician stopped typing, looking at me with a critical, unyielding gaze. We must consider the operational risk, she added. If we reinstate you and you are forced to drop out mid-semester due to legal battles or financial collapse, we lose that seat entirely. A waitlisted candidate offers a clean, stable transition. We are sympathetic to your personal struggles, but this committee is tasked with producing capable physicians, not rescuing victims of domestic sabotage. The cold clinical assessment hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They did not see a survivor. They saw a high-risk liability. They viewed my trauma as an impending failure metric. Panic surged hot and fast through my veins. My carefully constructed professional facade crumbled. I leaned over the table, gripping the mahogany edge until my bruised knuckles throbbed. I tried to argue that my ability to navigate the crisis proved my capability under pressure. I attempted to draw a parallel between managing Deli emergencies and clinical triage. But my exhaustion betrayed my intellect. I stumbled over my words, rushing the delivery. I tried to reference my strong performance in undergraduate anatomy courses, specifically my understanding of the cardiovascular system. But my brain misfired. I accidentally referred to the myocardium as the myocardium, throwing a harsh, awkward emphasis on the wrong syllable. I mispronounced a basic anatomical term right in front of the regional director of admissions. I stopped mid-sentence, my cheeks burning with intense mortification. I sounded unpolished, amateurish, and entirely out of my depth. The older physician sighed softly, making a notation in my file. I abandoned the professional rhetoric entirely. I let my guard down, dropping the clinical terminology. I pleaded with them, my voice cracking under the desperate weight of the moment. I begged them not to let my father's controlling abuse dictate the outcome of my life. I told them I possessed the deposit check right here on the table, ready to clear. I promised I would outwork every single student in the cohort. I openly laid my desperation bare, shedding every ounce of my dignity in that quiet paneled room. Dr. Thorne exchanged a long, silent glance with his colleagues. The communication was subtle but clear. The female physician offered a slight definitive shake of her head. The older man closed my file, folding his hands over the cardboard cover. They were preparing to dismiss my appeal. They were going to uphold the waitlisted candidate's admission and send me back to the North End Deli with my deposit check in hand. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, the fight draining from my muscles. The 8-hour bus ride, the bitter cold, the extortion, the screaming matches, all of it amounted to nothing. I had survived the gauntlet, only to be disqualified by the very grit that kept me alive. Dr. Thorne opened his mouth to deliver the final formal rejection. But before the first syllable left his lips, a sudden sharp clatter echoed from the left side of the table, abruptly shattering the suffocating tension in the room. Dr. Thorne inhaled deeply, preparing to deliver the final formal rejection. He looked at me, his expression a mask of practiced institutional sympathy. He opened his mouth, but the words never arrived. A sharp, sudden clatter erupted from the left side of the long mahogany table. The heavy glass water pitcher tipped over, spilling ice and water across the polished wood. The older physician, the one who had silently closed my file moments before, slumped forward. His chin struck his chest with a heavy, unnatural thud. His wire-rimmed glasses slid down the bridge of his nose, clattering onto the tabletop. His face had gone entirely gray, stripped of all color, and his breathing hitched into a shallow, erratic rattle. His body listed dangerously sideways, tilting precariously close to the edge of his high-backed leather chair. The immediate reaction from the remaining board members was not swift clinical action. It was a terrifying academic freeze. The female physician gasped, pushing her rolling chair backward and instinctively reaching for her mobile phone to dial campus security. Dr. Thorne stood up abruptly, knocking his knee against the heavy table. He called the older doctor's name, his voice sharp with sudden panic, but he hesitated. He hesitated to touch the man, unsure of the immediate physical intervention required outside of a controlled, sterile hospital environment. Sometimes the best way to prove you belong in a room is to take control when the room falls apart. I did not freeze. I did not reach for a phone or wait for campus protocols to dictate my actions. A cold, crystalline adrenaline flooded my system, overriding my exhaustion and my bruised dignity. I had spent 10 years navigating the sudden chaotic violence of a high-volume commercial kitchen. I had managed severed fingers from meat slicers, deep grease burns, and just days ago, my own father's cardiac collapse on a dirty linoleum floor. I did not require a sterile environment to function. I required action. I vaulted out of the hard wooden chair, shoving my heavy canvas duffel bag out of the path. I crossed the distance to the older physician in 3 rapid strides. The man was sliding out of his leather seat, his dead weight pulling him toward the floor. I grabbed his shoulders, hauling him back into a stable seated position. I felt the cold, clammy sweat coating his forehead. His skin was pale, and his pulse at the carotid artery was weak and thready. Dr. Thorne hovered behind me, barking a frantic demand to know what was happening. He leaned over my shoulder, crowding the tight space between the chairs. He reached out, grabbing the older doctor's arm, attempting to shake him awake. "Move out of the damn way!" I snapped, my voice harsh and commanding, entirely stripped of the deferential tone I had been using moments before. It was an incredibly unprofessional outburst, directed at the regional director of admissions, but the sharp rebuke was necessary to clear my working space. Dr. Thorne flinched, stepping back in shock, his authority momentarily overridden by my blunt blue-collar efficiency. I ignored his reaction, focusing entirely on the patient. The older doctor was experiencing a severe vasovagal syncope episode, likely triggered by a sudden drop in blood pressure or severe hypoglycemia. I grabbed the back of the heavy leather chair and pushed it backward, providing enough clearance to maneuver. I wrapped my arms under his armpits, using my leverage to slide his dead weight gently onto the carpeted floor, preventing a secondary head injury from a fall. I knelt beside him, checking his airway. It was clear. I grabbed a thick stack of manila folders from the table, ignoring the confidential admissions data scattering across the floor. I shoved the folders under his calves, elevating his legs to promote blood flow back to his brain and vital organs. I loosened his tight silk tie and unbuttoned his collar, allowing for unrestricted breathing. The female physician was loudly explaining the situation to the campus emergency dispatcher over her mobile phone. I demanded she ask the dispatcher for the estimated arrival time of the paramedics. She covered the receiver, conveying they were 3 minutes away. I stayed on the floor beside the older doctor, monitoring his weak pulse. I noted his shallow breathing, checking for signs of a deeper cardiac event. His skin remained clammy, but his breathing slowly began to regulate. He let out a low, groaning sigh, his eyelids fluttering as the elevated leg position forced oxygen-rich blood back into his system. I did not offer soothing platitudes. I kept my voice loud and sharp, calling his name and demanding he focus on the sound of my voice. I asked him basic orientation questions, maintaining his fragile consciousness, while the distant wail of an ambulance siren pierced the quiet morning air over the campus. Dr. Thorne watched me work. He stood a few feet away, observing my actions with a silent, intense scrutiny. He did not intervene again. He watched a disheveled, exhausted applicant covered in bruised knuckles and smelling of stale bus fumes handle a sudden medical crisis with cold, practiced precision. He saw the stark, undeniable contrast between his own academic hesitation and my gritty survival instinct. The heavy oak door of the committee room swung open. 2 paramedics rushed in carrying heavy jump bags and a mobile defibrillator. I immediately stepped back, yielding the space to the professional emergency responders. I delivered a rapid, concise handover detailing the sudden collapse, the pale, clammy skin, the weak pulse, and the elevated leg intervention. I used the correct clinical terminology, my earlier stutter completely vanishing in the face of a practical emergency. The paramedics took over, loading the groggy physician onto a mobile stretcher and wheeling him out of the room toward the waiting ambulance. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound, ringing silence in the committee room. The space was a wreck. Water pooled on the mahogany table, dripping onto the carpet. Confidential files lay scattered across the floor. The female physician sat heavily in her chair, staring blankly at her laptop screen, the adrenaline crash settling into her posture. I stood near the corner of the room, my chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly drained from my muscles. The sudden crisis had eclipsed my own desperate appeal. I realized I was still stranded. I had saved the doctor, but I had undoubtedly finalized my own rejection. Snapping at the regional director and cursing in a formal hearing was a fatal breach of professional conduct. I walked back toward my wooden chair, preparing to gather my duffel bag and the cashier's check. I was ready to leave the campus and figure out how to survive the impending legal storm back in Boise. But Dr. Thorne did not return to his seat. He stood near the spilled water pitcher, looking down at the scattered files on the floor. He slowly bent down, retrieving a single damp sheet of paper. He turned to face me, holding the document in his hand. His expression had fundamentally altered. The impenetrable clinical mask was gone, replaced by a sharp, assessing clarity. He was no longer looking at a high-risk liability. He was looking at a physician. "Emily," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet room, "you demonstrated an acute lack of professional decorum when you ordered me to move." He paused, allowing the weight of the reprimand to hang in the air. "However, you also demonstrated an exceptional capacity for decisive action under pressure. You prioritized patient stabilization over institutional hierarchy. That instinct cannot be taught in a lecture hall." He walked toward his chair, picking up his leather portfolio. He did not sit down. He looked at the female physician, who gave a slow, hesitant nod of agreement. Dr. Thorne turned back to me, his gaze fixed on my bruised hands. He asked me to sit back down. He told me the committee had not yet reached a formal conclusion regarding my missed enrollment deadline. He pulled a folder from his portfolio, sliding a faxed document onto the table. He said they needed to review a specific piece of legal evidence before rendering a final judgment, and he wanted me to explain exactly what I was looking at. Dr. Thorne tapped his index finger against the faxed document he had just pulled from his leather portfolio. The sudden medical crisis involving the older board member had completely shattered the sterile, formal atmosphere of the committee room. The remaining female physician was quietly wiping up the spilled water with a stack of paper towels, her hands still visibly shaking. I stood near my wooden chair, my adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion in my limbs. I looked down at the faxed paper sitting on the wet mahogany table. I recognized the official letterhead immediately. It was the sworn federal affidavit filed by Gary the Postman, detailing the intentional destruction of my medical school acceptance letter. Gary must have faxed it directly to the admissions office after I left the Greyhound station in Boise, ensuring the board had hard legal proof of the sabotage. Dr. Thorne leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. He did not look at the document. He looked directly into my eyes, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Emily," he began, his tone stripped of the earlier bureaucratic distance, "we are an academic institution bound by rigid state and federal regulations. The WWAMI regional program requires strict adherence to enrollment deadlines to secure funding quotas for Idaho residents. A missed deadline is typically an automatic forfeiture, regardless of the personal circumstances surrounding the failure." He gestured to the scattered files on the floor, the aftermath of my desperate intervention. "However, he continued, your performance in this room demonstrated a level of clinical competence and crisis management that we rarely see in incoming first-year students. You correctly identified a vasovagal episode, executed immediate stabilization protocols, and delivered a concise handover to emergency personnel. You did this while operating under profound physical exhaustion and extreme emotional distress." He picked up the faxed affidavit, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. He explained that while the committee could not reinstate my admission based on a sob story or personal hardship, they could operate within the specific parameters of administrative law. The affidavit filed by a sworn employee of the United States Postal Service provided a documented legal exception. He stated the committee was classifying my missed deadline under the formal category of federal mail interference outside applicant control. The words hung in this quiet air. Federal mail interference outside applicant control. It was a dry, technical, bureaucratic phrase. It was not a grand, sweeping declaration of my inherent worth. It was not a cinematic validation of my lifelong struggle. It was a technical loophole found deep within the university administrative bylaws. But it was the exact phrase required to unlock the door my father had tried so desperately to weld shut. Dr. Thorne set the affidavit down and picked up the cashier's check I had laid on the table earlier. He examined the printed amount, verifying the required $3,000 seat deposit. He handed the check to the female physician, who nodded silently, opening her laptop to process the transaction. Dr. Thorne turned back to me, offering a small, tight smile. He informed me that my admission to the WWAMI medical program was officially reinstated. He told me I was expected to attend the mandatory orientation session in exactly 3 weeks. He wished me luck, warning me that the curriculum would not be forgiving of any further personal distractions. When you finally get what you fought for, why does it feel like you have just survived a car crash? I did not jump up and down. I did not cheer or pump my fists in the air. I simply knotted my throat too tight to form words of gratitude. I reached out with a trembling hand, pulling the duplicate acceptance letter from my coat pocket and pressing it flat against the table for the final formal signature. Dr. Thorne signed the bottom corner, his pen scratching loudly across the paper. He handed it back to me, sealing the transaction. I grabbed my heavy canvas duffel bag, hauling the strap over my bruised shoulder. I muttered a quiet thank you to the remaining board members, turning on my heel and walking toward the heavy oak door. I pushed the brass handle, stepping out into the long, silent university corridor. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, severing my connection to the committee room. I stood alone in the hallway. The polished linoleum floor stretched out before me, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. I had won. I had secured my seat. I had beaten my father's sabotage, the fraudulent debt, the stolen car, and the bitter, freezing mountain passes. I held the signed acceptance letter in my hand, the physical proof of my victory. But I did not feel triumphant. I felt as though I had just been dragged underneath a moving vehicle. The sheer brutal violence of the last 72 hours crashed down upon me. I had screamed at my mother, extorted my dying father, accepted money from a bitter rival, and publicly cursed at an elite admissions director. I had compromised every piece of my moral foundation just to survive the gauntlet. My legs gave out. I slumped against the cool brick wall of the corridor, sliding down until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, dropping the canvas duffel bag beside me. The stoic professional physician persona I had constructed inside the committee room completely dissolved. I buried my face in my hands and began to cry. It was not a quiet, dignified weeping. It was a violent, ugly, racking sob. I gasped for air, my shoulders shaking uncontrollably. I cried for the terrifying 10 seconds I hesitated to call an ambulance for my father. I cried for the vicious, cruel words I spit at my mother in the deli kitchen. I cried for the massive, crushing $45,000 of commercial debt that still chained me to the family business. A passing student walking down the corridor holding a stack of textbooks slowed their pace, giving me a concerned, wary glance. I did not care. I sat on the floor of the elite academic building wearing a coat that smelled of stale pastrami and diesel fumes, sobbing until my ribs ached. The raw, shaking relief was a physical purge, expelling the toxic adrenaline that had kept me moving. I was free. I was officially a medical student. But the freedom carried a heavy, bitter price tag. I knew that my victory here in Moscow would trigger a catastrophic implosion back in Boise. By securing my seat and leaving the North End Deli, I had removed the critical pillar holding my father's business together. The fraudulent equipment debt, combined with the impending federal postal investigation, would inevitably crush the sandwich shop. I had saved myself, but I had initiated the destruction of my family empire. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat, dreading the inevitable fallout that was already beginning to unfold 300 miles away in a grease-stained kitchen. 6 months passed, marking the transition from the bitter, frozen winter to the dry, scorching heat of an Idaho summer. I remained in Moscow, throwing myself into the grueling, chaotic rhythm of the WWAMI medical curriculum. I buried my head in textbooks, memorizing the intricate pathways of the human nervous system and the complex biochemical reactions of cellular metabolism. The rigorous academic demand was a brutal but welcome distraction from the deafening silence radiating from the southern half of the state. I had not spoken to my parents since the day I walked out of St. Luke's Hospital with the signed treasury bond. I did not call. They did not reach out. The silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket we both refused to lift. I survived financially through a combination of federal student loans, dispersed after the dependency override cleared, and a grueling night shift job restocking shelves at a local grocery store. I slept 4 hours a night, subsisting on cheap ramen and instant coffee. It was an exhausting, lonely existence, but it belonged entirely to me. There were no commercial slicers to clean, no walk-in freezers threatening to bankrupt my life, no father looming over my shoulder dictating my worth. But distance does not sever the deep, tangled roots of a family business. The news from Boise arrived not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet, hesitant phone call from Gary the postman. He tracked down my new apartment number, calling me on a Sunday morning while I was studying for a pharmacology exam. "Emily," he started, his voice carrying a heavy reluctance, "I thought you should know what is happening down here in the North End. The neighborhood is changing fast." The rapid gentrification of downtown Boise was pushing out the old immigrant businesses, replacing them with sleek wine bars and overpriced artisanal boutiques. The North End Deli, with its fading linoleum and ancient display cases, was a relic struggling to survive the rising tide of high commercial rent. But gentrification was not the primary catalyst for the implosion. I was the catalyst. Can you ever truly celebrate your freedom when it is paid for with your family's empire? Gary laid out the brutal mechanics of the fallout. Without my 80 hours of unpaid weekly labor, Hank was forced to hire 2 full-time employees to cover the prep work and manage the front counter. The sudden massive increase in payroll overhead crippled the delicate financial margins of the sandwich shop. Simultaneously, the $45,000 of fraudulent equipment debt began demanding aggressive monthly repayments. Hank could no longer hide the defaulted loans under my Social Security number because I had frozen my credit file, blocking any further leveraging. The pressure fractured the foundation of the business. But the final fatal blow came from the federal government. Gary confirmed the postal inspector pursued the mail tampering investigation. They did not file federal felony charges, opting instead to issue a severe administrative penalty and a crushing fine. Hank avoided prison, but the legal fees required to retain a defense attorney drained his remaining meager operational capital. Facing immediate total foreclosure and the complete seizure of his assets, Hank ran out of options. The banks refused to refinance his debt. The predatory lenders turned him away. He was backed into a corner, terrified of reliving the traumatic childhood memory of watching his own father's farm auctioned off to strangers. In a bitter twist of poetic justice, Hank was forced to sell a significant equity stake in the deli to secure an immediate cash injection. He did not sell to a quiet, anonymous investor. He sold exactly 49% of the North End Deli to Marcus. The rival shop owner who bought my Greyhound bus ticket, the man Hank despised above all others, was now a managing partner in the family business. Gary told me Marcus initiated a rapid, aggressive overhaul of the shop. He replaced the old, faded awning with a sleek, modern sign. He introduced high-margin gourmet items, phasing out the traditional working-class menu Hank had maintained for 3 decades. Hank was no longer the sole, undisputed king of his grease-stained castle. He was forced to answer to a younger, arrogant boss who viewed the deli as a mere asset in a growing corporate portfolio. Susan remained at the shop, trapped in the same repetitive cycle. Gary said he saw her sweeping the floors and restocking the new imported organic sodas Marcus insisted on selling. She stayed by Hank's side, anchoring herself to the sinking ship, accepting the new management, rather than facing the terrifying prospect of starting over. I thanked Gary for the update, hanging up the phone and staring blankly at the dense text of my pharmacology book. The words blurred together. I did not feel the surge of victorious satisfaction I expected. I did not feel vindicated hearing that my father was finally suffering the consequences of his tyrannical control. Instead, a sharp, confusing pang of jealousy pierced my chest. It was an ugly, irrational emotion that made no logical sense. I had fought tooth and nail to escape that kitchen. I had punched my steering wheel until my knuckles bled, cursing the smell of pastrami and the constant hum of the broken freezer. But hearing that Marcus was tearing down the old menus, changing the recipes, and dictating the daily operations felt like a profound personal violation. The North End Deli was a prison, but it was my prison. I knew the exact sweet spot on the meat slicer to get the perfect cut of corned beef. I knew exactly how much water to feed the 50-year-old sourdough starter to keep it alive during the harsh winter months. I spent my entire childhood sweeping those floors, breathing that air, serving those customers. The realization that a cynical, opportunistic stranger was now running my father's kitchen, erasing the legacy my family had built, produced a raw, twisting ache in my stomach. I slumped forward, resting my head on the open textbook. I mourned the loss of the family empire I had fought so desperately to flee. I mourned the tragic, broken pride of my father, who was now forced to swallow his dignity every single day, taking orders from a rival just to keep the lights on. I mourned my mother, who traded her only daughter's freedom to fix a broken compressor, only to end up working for the very man who orchestrated her husband's humiliation. I was successfully navigating the rigorous demands of medical school. I was passing my exams, earning the respect of my professors, and building a secure, independent future. But the victory felt profoundly hollow. I had severed the toxic, infected limb to save my life, but the phantom pain of the amputation throbbed relentlessly. I realized that surviving a toxic family dynamic does not erase the deep, tangled roots of loyalty and shared history. I was free, but I was also entirely alone, carrying the heavy, invisible burden of knowing my escape was the direct cause of my family's ruin. I wiped a stray tear from my cheek, closing the textbook, and preparing for another lonely night shift at the grocery store, unaware that a silent, imperfect echo from that ruined deli was already traveling 300 miles north, seeking me out. The oppressive heat of the Idaho summer eventually gave way to the crisp, sharp chill of an early autumn. My first semester at the WWAMI medical program was a blur of intense academic pressure and relentless fatigue. I navigated the grueling curriculum with a desperate, frantic energy, pouring every ounce of my focus into anatomy lectures and clinical labs. The demanding schedule left little room for reflection, which was exactly how I preferred to operate. The silence from Boise remained unbroken, a heavy void that I carefully avoided examining too closely. I had secured a cramped, shared apartment near the campus, moving my meager belongings into a small bedroom that smelled of old paint and cheap carpet cleaner. It was a stark, minimalist space devoid of history or comfort, but it was entirely mine. I spent a rare, quiet Sunday morning attempting to organize the chaos of my small bedroom. I hauled the cheap canvas duffel bag I had packed in a blind panic months ago out from under the narrow twin bed. I unzipped the main compartment, pulling out wrinkled sweaters, heavy wool socks, and a jumbled assortment of practical necessities. At the very bottom of the bag, wrapped tightly in a plastic grocery sack, I felt a cold, hard, cylindrical object. I pulled the bundle out and peeled back the plastic. It was a small glass mason jar sealed tightly with a rusted metal lid. My breath caught in my throat. During my frantic, chaotic departure from the North End Deli, before the screaming match with my mother and the horrifying collapse of my father, I had scooped a small portion of the 50-year-old sourdough starter into this jar. It was an impulsive, irrational action, driven by a deep, subconscious need to carry a piece of my heritage with me into the unknown. The sourdough culture was a living, breathing artifact of my family history. My great-grandfather brought the original yeast strain over during the early agricultural booms in the Treasure Valley. Hank treated the bubbling mixture with religious reverence, feeding it equal parts flour and water every single day to keep the microscopic organisms alive and active. The distinct sharp tang of the deli bread, the very foundation of the family business, relied entirely on the continuous survival of this specific culture. I carried the glass jar to the small window, holding it up to the pale morning light filtering through the blinds. The mixture inside was no longer a vibrant, bubbly matrix. It had separated into a thick, dense sludge of gray flour, at the bottom topped with a layer of dark, murky liquid. The distinct sharp aroma of active fermentation was gone, replaced by a stale, sour odor of decay. The sourdough starter was dead. I had been so consumed by the brutal mechanics of my own survival, securing the federal loans, navigating the rigorous academic demands, and working exhausting night shifts at the grocery store, that I had completely neglected the fragile living organism sitting at the bottom of my duffel bag. I forgot to feed it. I forgot to nurture the very connection I had impulsively tried to preserve. How do you mourn the very chains that kept you bound? I stared at the murky, lifeless jar, a profound, sweeping melancholy settling over my chest. The dead yeast was not just a ruined baking ingredient. It was a stark, undeniable physical symbol of my severed ties to my family legacy. By walking out of that kitchen and refusing to surrender my future, I had starved the connection. I let the old ways die to ensure my own survival. The heavy, burdensome reality of my independence crashed down upon me. I was no longer an extension of the North End Deli. I was an isolated, untethered entity floating in a sterile academic void. I set the glass jar down on the cheap particle board desk, my hands trembling. The overwhelming guilt of the survivor, a dark, insidious emotion I had kept successfully buried beneath medical textbooks and exhaustion, finally breached the surface. I thought about Hank swallowing his pride, taking orders from his bitter rival Marcus, just to keep the business afloat. I thought about Susan sweeping the floors under new management, trapped in a miserable loop, because she chose her husband's failing empire over her daughter's freedom. I was succeeding. I was wearing a stethoscope and passing difficult exams, but my success was built directly on the charred ruins of their livelihood. The isolation became unbearable. The quiet walls of my student apartment offered no comfort, no buffer against the crushing weight of my own actions. I needed to hear a familiar voice. I needed to bridge the silent void, even if it meant exposing my raw, bleeding wounds to the people who inflicted them. I grabbed my cell phone from the bed, dropping onto the thin mattress. I pulled up my mother's contact information, my thumb hesitating over the call button. I had not spoken to Susan since the explosive confrontation in the alleyway, where I called her a spineless coward. The memory of my own cruelty tasted like ash in my mouth. I pressed the green button, lifting the phone to my ear. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. The mechanical automated voice of the carrier system clicked on, informing me the caller was unavailable. The beep signaled the start of the recording. I did not hang up. I did not leave a brief, polite message asking her to call me back. I broke. The stoic professional facade I maintained for my professors and classmates completely dissolved, leaving a terrified, guilt-ridden daughter holding the phone. "Mom," I whispered, my voice cracking instantly. "It is Emily. I know you are probably working at the shop right now. I know you probably do not want to hear from me." A hot tear slipped down my cheek, splashing onto the screen of the phone. I pulled my knees to my chest, curling into a tight ball on the narrow bed. I did not deliver a calm, composed apology. I left a rambling, chaotic, tearful message exposing the deep, messy reality of my grief. "I am so sorry," I choked out a sob tearing through my chest. "I am so sorry for what I said to you in the alley. I was angry and I was terrified, but you did not deserve those words. You did not deserve to be called a coward. I know you were just trying to survive the only way you knew how. I know you were terrified of losing the deli." I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. The words spilled out in a frantic, desperate rush. I told her about the dead sourdough starter in the glass jar. I told her I tried to bring a piece of home with me, but I failed to keep it alive. I confessed the profound, agonizing guilt I carried, knowing my departure forced Hank to sell the business to Marcus. "I am succeeding up here, Mom," I sobbed, the pain radiating through my ribs. "I am passing my classes. I am going to be a doctor. But it feels so wrong. It feels like I stole my life by destroying yours. I miss you. I miss the smell of the kitchen. I miss the noise. I am so sorry I broke our family apart to save myself. I did not know how else to survive." I continued to weep into the receiver, the automated recording system capturing every jagged breath and desperate apology. I laid my immense vulnerability bare, proving I was not just a victorious, independent heroine. I was a deeply wounded young woman carrying the massive collateral damage of my own escape. The automated system finally beeped, cutting off my rambling message and ending the recording. I dropped the phone onto the mattress, burying my face in my hands. The silence in the apartment resumed thick and heavy, offering no absolution. I had cast my raw, bleeding apology into the void, unsure if Susan would ever listen to the message or if Hank would intercept it and delete it. I remained suspended in the agonizing space between my past and my future, bearing the full, brutal cost of my freedom. I wiped my face, bracing myself for the grueling years of medical training ahead, completely unaware that my frantic, tearful voicemail would eventually trigger a silent, imperfect response from a man who refused to surrender his pride but could not entirely abandon his daughter. 4 grueling years slipped through the hourglass, demanding a toll paid in sleep deprivation and relentless focus. I navigated the punishing gauntlet of the WWAMI medical curriculum, learning to function on 3 hours of rest and stale cafeteria coffee. I spent my days memorizing the intricate pathways of the human nervous system and my nights stocking canned goods at the local grocery store to keep a roof over my head. The raw, aching guilt of my departure slowly calloused over, transforming into a quiet, persistent drive. I received no phone calls from the Treasure Valley. No letters arrived from the North End Deli. I lived in a self-imposed exile, building an independent future brick by exhausting brick. The culmination of that relentless grind arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon in May. The university auditorium buzzed with a bright electric energy. Hundreds of folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a polished wooden stage adorned with formal academic banners. This was the white coat ceremony, a rite of passage marking our transition from classroom theory to clinical practice. It was the physical manifestation of the title I had fought so desperately to earn. I stood in the wings with my cohort, listening to the dull roar of the gathering crowd. The air conditioning hummed, blowing cool, sterile air across my face. When the dean called my name, I walked across the wooden stage, my posture straight and my stride measured. A senior faculty member held up the pristine, crisp white garment. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, feeling the heavy woven fabric settle over my shoulders. The embroidered black lettering above the breast pocket caught the stage lights. Emily, Doctor of Medicine candidate. I turned to face the audience as the applause echoed through the cavernous hall. A sea of proud families filled the rows. Fathers held up cameras. Mothers wiped tears from their cheeks. Siblings held colorful bouquets of flowers and handmade signs. I scanned the middle section where a block of empty seats sat stark and vacant. I had mailed a formal invitation to Boise 2 months prior, a quiet olive branch cast into the void. Hank and Susan did not make the drive. There was no cinematic reunion waiting for me in the auditorium. The heavy steel doors at the back of the room did not suddenly swing open to reveal my parents rushing down the aisle, begging for forgiveness. The harsh reality of American family estrangement offers very few neat Hollywood resolutions. My parents were 300 miles away, likely working the grueling lunch rush under the watchful eye of a man they despised. They stayed entrenched in their familiar grease-stained reality, unable to bridge the chasm of pride and profound hurt that separated us. I did not let my face betray the deep, sharp sting radiating through my chest. I maintained my composure, offering a polite nod to the faculty before walking down the wooden steps. When the ceremony concluded, the lobby transformed into a chaotic, joyful reception. Classmates embraced their weeping parents, posing for endless photographs under the bright foyer lights. The suffocating warmth of their celebrations pressed against my ribcage, highlighting the vast empty space where my own family should have been. I slipped away from the crowded reception, navigating the quiet, twisting corridors of the medical annex. I needed the isolation of the student locker room to catch my breath. Pushing through the swinging door, I was met with the familiar scent of institutional floor wax and rubbing alcohol. The room was empty, the rows of gray metal lockers standing silent and uniform. I walked toward my designated cubby, exhaling a long, ragged breath. Sitting on the wooden bench directly in front of my locker was a square cardboard shipping box. I stopped in my tracks. The box bore a prominent red and white Priority Overnight Express label. My name and campus address were printed in stark block letters. I stepped closer, examining the return address in the top left corner. It was a local Boise zip code, but the name line was left entirely blank. I reached down and broke the heavy packing tape, peeling back the cardboard flaps. Inside the box rested a small, insulated silver thermal pouch surrounded by frozen gel packs. I unzipped the silver pouch. The smell hit me before my eyes could register the contents. It was a visceral, pungent aroma that instantly shattered the sterile academic atmosphere of the locker room. The sharp tang of cured meat, the biting acidity of stone, ground mustard, and the deep, rich yeast of fresh-baked bread flooded my senses. It was a smell permanently encoded into my DNA. Inside the pouch sat a large sandwich wrapped tightly in thick brown butcher paper. I lifted the heavy package, my hands beginning to tremble. The butcher paper was folded with meticulous sharp creases secured by a single piece of masking tape. It was a precise structural wrap job designed to prevent the juices from leaking through the paper. I knew that specific folding technique intimately. I had watched my father execute that exact wrap 10,000 times behind the glass display case of the North End Deli. I searched the bottom of the cardboard box, pulling out the gel packs and flattening the insulation. I looked for a greeting card, a sticky note, a scrap of paper bearing a simple congratulations or a request for contact. The box was empty. There was no grand declaration of remorse. There was no written plea for reconciliation. Some apologies do not come with words, they come wrapped in butcher paper. Hank had received my tearful, rambling voicemail years ago. He knew my sourdough starter had died. He knew I carried the heavy, suffocating guilt of surviving the collapse of his empire. My father was a proud, stubborn man, scarred by generational debt and terrified of institutional authority. He lacked the emotional vocabulary to articulate his regret. He could not bring himself to sit in a university auditorium surrounded by elite academics and wealthy families to celebrate the very institution he believed would destroy me. But he had baked the bread. He had fed the 50-year-old sourdough culture rising hours before dawn to knead the dough and monitor the fermentation. He had sliced the pastrami thick, stacking it exactly the way I preferred. He had packed it in dry ice, paid an exorbitant fee for overnight shipping, and trusted the federal mail system he despised to deliver his silent message across state lines. It was a fragile, imperfect offering, proving he still recognized me as his daughter without forcing him to admit defeat. I clutched the wrapped sandwich to my chest, walking out of the locker room and pushing through the rear exit of the building. The cool spring air hit my face as I navigated the asphalt parking lot. I found my rusted sedan parked near the edge of the campus perimeter. The car was a battered relic, holding thousands of miles of difficult memories. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut and sealing myself inside the quiet cabin. I sat behind the steering wheel wearing my pristine white coat. The heavy fabric felt rigid and official, a stark symbol of my hard-won independence. I rested the sandwich on my lap, tearing the piece of masking tape and unfolding the brown butcher paper. The thick slices of warm pastrami steamed slightly in the cool air of the car. The sourdough crust was baked to a dark golden brown, carrying the distinct sour tang of my great-grandfather's original yeast strain. I lifted the heavy sandwich with both hands, bringing it to my mouth. I took a deep, deliberate bite. The flavors exploded across my palate. The salty, rich meat mingled with the sharp heat of the mustard and the dense, chewy texture of the fresh bread. It tasted exactly like home. It tasted like early mornings standing on a milk crate, studying flashcards, while the walk-in freezer hummed in the background. It tasted like survival. A thick, heavy drop of yellow mustard squeezed out from the crust, falling directly onto the crisp white lapel of my medical coat. I looked down at the bright yellow stains sinking into the pristine woven fabric. It was a permanent glaring mark ruining the flawless professional uniform I had sacrificed so much to earn. I did not scramble for a napkin. I did not attempt to scrub the stain away. I leaned back against the headrest of the rusted sedan and let out a sudden ragged laugh. The laugh caught in my throat, transforming into a deep, rolling sob. Tears spilled over my lower lashes, tracking down my cheeks and falling onto the butcher paper in my lap. I wept alone in the parking lot, embracing the messy, beautiful reality of my survival. The bright yellow stain on my lapel was not a ruinous flaw. It was a permanent badge of honor. It proved that my new life and my old life were inextricably bound together. I was a physician capable of commanding a trauma room and navigating the sterile elite corridors of modern medicine. But I would always be the girl from the North End Deli carrying the scent of pastrami and the undeniable grit of a working-class upbringing. The chains that once bound me were broken, but the roots remained intact. My father had not surrendered his pride, and I had not surrendered my future. We were locked in a quiet, distant standoff, choosing to communicate through overnight shipping and unsaid words. It was a fractured, incomplete resolution, offering no cinematic neatness. I took another bite of the sandwich, the tears mixing with the salt of the cured meat. I sat in the cold car wearing my stained white coat, looking out at the sprawling university campus through the smudged windshield. I had paid a brutal, unforgiving price for my freedom. But as I swallowed the last bite of the sourdough bread, I finally knew, without a shred of doubt, that the toll was worth every single penny. Sitting in that rusted sedan with a mustard stain on my new white coat, I realized that surviving a toxic family is not a clean cinematic break. It is a messy, lifelong negotiation between the history you survived and the future you are building. The smell of pastrami will always remind me of my father's heavy expectations, but the stethoscope around my neck reminds me that I hold the pen to my own narrative. I paid a brutal price for my independence. I lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I gained my own life. Looking back at the frozen highways, the stolen mail, and the quiet desperation of my mother, I carry 5 distinct truths with me into the hospital corridors every single day. First, I learned that drawing a hard boundary is a fundamental act of survival. I spent years believing that familial loyalty required me to sacrifice my own ambitions to keep a failing sandwich shop afloat. But you cannot heal or grow in an environment designed to keep you small. Walking away from a toxic dynamic is not a betrayal. It is necessary self-preservation. Second, I discovered the vital difference between protection and possession. My father claimed he was shielding me from the burden of institutional debt, but toxic control builds a cage and demands gratitude for the locks. True affection empowers you to walk out the front door, trusting that you are strong enough to navigate the harsh winter cold on your own terms. Third, I learned that forgiveness does not require a tearful reunion or a return to the abuse. You can accept an imperfect, silent apology shipped overnight in a cardboard box without handing the keys to your life back to the person who broke your heart. True peace often demands permanent emotional and geographical distance from the people who refuse to respect your autonomy. Fourth, I realized that the ultimate defense against manipulation is undeniable competence. You do not defeat a tyrant by screaming louder in a grease-stained kitchen or begging for their permission. You defeat them by walking into an elite boardroom, taking control of a crisis, and building a track record so solid that their attempts to sabotage you shatter against your actual proven worth. Finally, I learned to stop scrubbing away my own history. The yellow mustard staining my pristine professional lapel proved that you can carry the grit of a working-class upbringing into the most exclusive rooms in the country. You do not have to erase where you came from to deserve where you are going. Your roots form your foundation, but they never have to dictate your ceiling. I am a doctor now. I save lives relying on the very instincts I honed behind a deli counter. If you have ever had to fight your own blood to claim your rightful place in the world, I want you to know that the survivor guilt eventually fades, but the freedom lasts forever. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you found strength in my story, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Olivia Stories Revenge. Drop a comment below and share the hardest boundary you ever had to draw for your own survival. I read every single one. You are never alone in the fight for your future.